the deal. And that's before you even get started thinking about Labour MPs. So part of Downing Street is focusing on whether a deal can be struck. Another part is focusing on will it get back through the Commons? And then we have to think about what would happen if a deal isn't agreed. Now, that makes things more complicated because the Ben Act says that the Prime Minister has if he can't get that agreement, then he will be writing to the European Union asking for an extension. And that, in and of itself, even though Boris Johnson has said, I will never ask for an extension, we think we can still do it, and of course it would be overridden by the deal. The question then becomes, what will the European Union do? And there are some suggestions here in Westminster, and I will caveat it by saying there are lots of things flying around, that perhaps the EU might hold off replying to that letter. Maybe they would try and help the UK government out just to get that deal over the line.
Any clearer. içerisindeki yakın vadedeki karşılıklı çatışma seslerinin, silah seslerinin zaman zaman değilse de yoğunlaştığını söylemek mümkün. O yoğunlaşan silah sesleri sonrasında dumanlarında arttığını söylüyor İngiliz Amerika. Şu an için silah sesi, çatışma seslerini duymuyoruz ancak zaman zaman bunlar artıyor. Şu an Brezilyalı'da çatışma seslerini
which are compatible with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and the Prime Minister has been very consistent on that, and I think you know,
especially if EU state rules were applied more.
These things need to be looked at in the round, and as I say, part of the reason within the package to have the commitment on a new deal is a recognition, as the Prime Minister set out in his public conference. These things need to be looked at in the round, and as I say, part of the reason. The wider message that certainly I take from engagement, and also the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland takes from his engagement, is again the desire to ensure we leave in a smooth and orderly way, because that is the way of best best addressing the concerns that have been raised.
And the last question then, just in terms of what has been proposed by at least what they have said in public, what the Irish government and they said in public about the different arrangements for Northern Ireland, what assessment has the government made of the kind of checks that we required from GB to Northern Ireland to facilitate, if those demands of the EU and the Irish were to be acceded to facilitate the checks on goods between GB, Northern Ireland, to Northern Ireland, GB and Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the absolute priority that we have is to ensure that Northern Ireland will be fully part of the UK customs territory. In terms of the negotiations and how that commitment is then taken forward, obviously one has to have clarity on what those arrangements are before one can start to assess and do any impact assessments or address what mitigations are required. So I think we need to give the negotiators space. I'm sure you would recognise that. These issues will come back to the House for consideration, but we need to ensure that the negotiators are able to proceed.
And by Saturday, will we have clarity on exactly the kind of infrastructure that would have to be put in place if such an agreement were reached, so that people voting in this will be voting on it with total knowledge of the kind of impediments that may be placed on trade between GB and Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the first order of business is to see whether we can secure a deal with the EU. That is what Mr Wilson were absolutely focused on with the government on delivering. Once we have that clarity, then clearly there will be an urgent need to bring that matter back to the House and to get into these very important issues that you raise.
Okay. Just on that last point that Samuel Wilson's raised, is it the government's policy that it would not accept customs checks in the Irish Sea? The government's policy, I'm not asking what's going on in the negotiations, but is it the government's policy that it is opposed to customs checks in the Irish Sea?
Well, again, what we've said throughout is it is essential that the Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom customs territory. Because that is a sort of fundamental point in terms of UK sovereignty and UK control of its trade policy. Again, once we start to get into the details operationally then as to some of the arrangements, that is an issue that is part of the negotiations. And I think colleagues would understand, given the sensitivity of the point at which we reach, that it is better that we come back to the House and discuss these issues once there is further clarity.
Okay, Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Chair, and many thanks for your patience, Secretary of State. I think we've actually overrun our time now, but if I could just test your patience a little further. Just building on what my colleague, Mr McFadden, was asking about the political declaration on the future relationship, and specifically on this issue of regulatory divergence. You received a letter from 5 key manufacturing industries, alongside Mr Gove, I believe, aerospace, automotive, chemicals, food and drink and pharmaceuticals. All of those industries are responsible for employing thousands and thousands of people in our constituencies, and I have no doubt in yours as well. And they raised very serious concerns about regulatory divergence. They talked about the damage which would be done by the current approach on regulatory divergence. They said pan-European regulatory alignment has been a success in our industry, supporting continued creation and retention of highly skilled manufacturing jobs in the UK. It is important this regulatory alignment should continue after Brexit as a critical element of the UK's future relationship with the EU. Do you intend to respond to that letter? And if so, could you give us a sense of what we will be saying in the response?
Well, I think that letter, which I very much recall, in part because of the seniority of those that sent it, is part of a very extensive amount of engagement we have been doing with the business community and others throughout this process. And I'm sure we will respond. Partly of it will be shaped by the negotiations that are ongoing in terms of how we move forward. But the wider point is that the best way of addressing the concerns, and I know you've spoken very eloquently about this in the Chamber yourself, is the implementation period gives business confidence through a deal moving forward. Now, in terms of the wider political declaration and the time frame of that is part of the negotiations that we are having. But the key issue from a UK point of view is we have world-leading standards. There is no intention to have some sort of race to the bottom deregulatory approach for reasons that I've already set out. And if one looks at the Queen's speech, you see from the Prime Minister a very strong commitment to having high standards.
But clearly, this change in policy from the government, dropping level playing field, is about, I think what Mr. McKinley was referring to earlier, about being prepared to do deals with other bits of the world. The concern that these absolutely key manufacturing industries is raising is that by engaging in that strategy, you will by definition be opening the risk, in the Europeans' eyes, of social dumping, environmental dumping, and creating what Angela Merkel said in her speech in Paris, a Singapore on Thames, right on the other side of the channel. And surely you would agree that the EU will then be inevitably bound to raise non-tariff barriers to ensure that it's protecting its market and its standards. But so you've said that the outcome is shaped by the inputs, but if the inputs are bound to lead to a minimization of access for these key products and these key industries into that key market on the other side of the channel, you surely recognise that that could potentially do serious damage to the British manufacturing industry.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Gill, there's probably more common ground in our positions than perhaps the debate might suggest, in that, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're alluding to the fact that there is an interplay between market access and what commitments are made. And I absolutely recognise that. It'd be, when I spoke about legitimate EU equities, obviously one of the issues they will have, which is on the one hand, they want access themselves to the UK market. It is an important market. But in terms of the size of the EU market, there is always, in any trade deal, and I reference even within the CETA trade deal, there is language on this point around the trade-off in a trade deal between what commitments are given and what market access you undertake. And that's why I reference back to a slide which I'm sure you're very familiar with, the famous escalator slide, where the Commission themselves made a similar point. So I don't think, if I may say, that you and I, if I'm understanding correctly, are disagreeing, that there is this interplay, and part of the negotiation will be to have discussions of this very order.
But if I could just bring it back also to the sort of question of the parliamentary arithmetic to which Mr. Ginogly referred, you must surely see and understand that when Labour members of Parliament see a letter like that from aerospace, automotive, chemicals, food and drink and pharma, major employers in our constituencies, it rings very large alarm bells with us. And I just don't really understand why the government chose to put that line in that Mr. McFadden referred to earlier, explicitly saying there is no need for the extensive level playing field arrangements envisaged in the previous protocol, because that's clearly what triggered this letter and these concerns. Yeah. So can you, given the parliamentary arithmetic, given the serious concerns raised in this letter, can you please explain what was the thinking that underpinned putting that sentence in?
Well, I think, so the thinking is because the government was able to be more explicit than the previous government in terms of the future relationship. In fact, one of the criticisms I received on behalf of the previous government was that the political declaration was too wide in scope. And you'll be familiar in terms of your own conversations with EU interlocutors that they previously questioned whether the UK had been specific enough in terms of what future relationship it was seeking, and that is a question that the Prime Minister has answered, and therefore the line to which you referred is a reflection of that. But moving forward, I am very aware of the parliamentary arithmetic. I'm very happy to reach out and to have further conversations away from the committee with colleagues on all sides of the House on these issues. Of course, in terms of the third meaningful vote, which failed to carry the House, that was separate to many of these issues. But at the same time, I do recognise these are important issues for members across the House, and I'm very happy to have further discussions with them as part of that.
One final point. I mean, on the political declaration, I mean, I accept that it's going to be a movable feast to some extent during the transition period, and the government will need to agree a negotiating mandate with the European Union, and you move forward through the various stages. But the reality is, when we go through those division lobbies to vote, we're voting on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. And the political declaration is a vitally important and politically binding statement of intent, because whilst I would love to dream that we will have Labour governments for the next 100 years, the chances of that, I'm sure everyone would agree, are fairly slim. So we're voting in light of the possibility that there may not be a Labour government negotiating the turning the political declaration into an international treaty which will define the future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom for generations to come, potentially. So when we go through those division lobbies, we are doing so on the basis of an understanding that this is a binding political declaration which actually transcends party politics. Would you agree that that's a fair interpretation?
So I would very much agree, Mr. Kinnett, that the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration are part of a package, where, if I may say, I'd slightly disagree, is that previously a huge amount of work was done to try and address concerns around across the House. And yet even on the third meaningful vote, when it was purely on the withdrawal agreement and not linked to the political declaration, then the arguments to which you've just referred at that time were not persuasive to many colleagues across the House. So I think the key issue is very happy to have further conversations with members on all sides, but clearly it will be shaped by the future negotiation, and in order for us to get into that, we need to be able to pass the withdrawal agreement.
One very final point. I see the point that you're making around having no political declaration whatsoever, which in effect that was the third meaningful vote, was just the withdrawal agreement and no political declaration. But I mean, in a sense, that it makes you even more of a hostage to fortune, because you have no statement of intent whatsoever then, but you do have lines like this in the letter that was sent saying we're going to drop all the level playing field arrangements. So I would gently suggest that it is better, I think, for the government to come forward with a clear statement of what it intends in terms of the future relationship, because then we at least know what we're doing and people know what they're voting for or against in that circumstance.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, Secretary of State, that is it. Can I just say, for the record from the Chair, that no member of this committee is biased. We just happen to have different views and everyone is entitled to have them, including yourself. We're very grateful to you for coming this morning. Yeah. And if I can end by saying, may there be light at the end of everyone's tunnel. Yes. Order, order.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Podcast.